South Bronx, New York City, the second week of March, 2023. Something was recorded there that officially should not exist anymore. First, a rooftop pigeon coop was broken into overnight. The wire mesh wasn't torn. It was peeled back in one clean curl, like fingers working under a seam. 6 birds gone, no feathers scattered, no blood on the roof. Then came the second sign. A pigeon keeper 3 blocks away found one of his own birds, cached 8 feet up in a tree fork, untouched except for the head and neck, wedged into the branch like something meant to come back for it later. A hawk strike doesn't explain it. Hawks kill from above and leave a spray of down exactly where the strike happens. A raccoon doesn't explain it either. Raccoons tear and force their way in. They don't peel wire back in a single motion and disappear without a trace. There is, however, one animal on record for producing exactly this signature. An entry wound that looks peeled rather than torn. A kill bite to the base of the skull. Prey cached above the ground to be eaten later. The problem is that, officially, this animal has not existed anywhere in New York City for more than 100 years. And this was not an isolated incident. In February 2023, a nearly identical break-in was logged 3 miles away in Throgs Neck. In April, another, further south, in Mott Haven. By the time anyone connected the pattern, the strongest physical evidence had already been sitting quietly on file for almost a year and a half. A wildlife camera 18 miles north of that first coop on the Bronx River, catching the animal itself on video. But there is a case far harder to explain than any of that. In 1987, a New York City Parks Department forester conducting a routine tree survey in Van Cortlandt Park encountered the same animal while on the job. He watched it for nearly 4 minutes at a distance of less than 30 feet, long enough to note the ear notch, the gait, the size, before it dropped into a drainage culvert and was gone. Then he did exactly what a trained field employee is supposed to do. He filed an official wildlife observation report with the department that same week. And that's where the story turns strange. Because that report was never entered into the state's rare species tracking system. It sat, unprocessed, for 11 months before being quietly redirected, not into any public sighting log, but into an internal research file that was never released. This video is about why. To understand what that means, start where the current pattern actually began. Pre-dawn, South Bronx, the second week of March. Ray Delgado climbs the fire escape to his rooftop coop the way he has for 11 years, coffee in one hand, flashlight in the other, expecting nothing but the low murmur of 40 pigeons waking up to feed. What he finds instead stops him on the ladder. The wire mesh along the coop's north face isn't torn. It's peeled, bent back in a clean curl, like someone worked their fingers under the seam and pulled. 6 birds are gone. No feathers scattered across the tar roof, no blood trail, none of the telltale down-and-carcass mess a red-tailed hawk leaves when it hits a coop from above. Delgado has lost birds to hawks before. 30 years of keeping pigeons on rooftops from Hunts Point to Mott Haven has taught him what a hawk strike looks like, what a raccoon break-in looks like, even what a determined house cat can manage. This is none of those. He photographs 3 parallel claw gouges on the coop's support post, deep enough to catch a fingernail, and posts the pictures to a pigeon fancier forum before sunrise, asking a question nobody answers with any confidence. What did this? The post gets 40 replies in a day. A keeper in Throgs Neck says the same thing happened to his coop in February. Mesh peeled, birds gone, no blood. A keeper near Pelham Bay says he found a dead pigeon cached in the fork of a tree behind his building, untouched except for the head and neck, wedged into the branches 8 feet up like something had stored it there to come back for later. None of it fits the predators these men know. It isn't a hawk kill, which comes from above and leaves a spray of down where the strike happened. It isn't a raccoon's clumsy, opportunistic mess, all torn wire and scattered feed. Something is working the rooftops of the Bronx with a precision and a climbing ability the city's pigeon keepers have never had to reckon with. And by the time wildlife officials start comparing notes, The pattern has already spread across 3 neighborhoods with no explanation attached to it and no name anyone is willing to put on it yet. For over a century, the official record on this animal has been unambiguous. Gone. The fisher, Piconia pennanti, a forest-dwelling member of the weasel family built like a cross between a large mink and a small bear cub, once ranged across the wooded lowlands that became New York City, hunting squirrels, rabbits, and, notably, long before any pigeon coop existed to tempt one, birds nesting in the hardwood canopy that used to cover most of the borough. Fur-trapping records from the late 1800s show fisher pelts moving through Hudson Valley trading posts by the thousands, prized for their dense, glossy underfur, and then, within a few decades, almost not at all. Combined with the wholesale clearing of the region's old-growth forest for timber, charcoal production, and farmland, the Fisher's range contracted north with brutal speed, retreating toward the higher, less accessible terrain of the Catskills and Adirondacks, where trapping pressure was lighter and forest cover held longer. By the early 1900s, state wildlife surveys listed the species as extirpated from the New York City area, a formal designation meaning a species that once existed in a region no longer does, distinct from extinction, which means it no longer exists anywhere at all. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Extirpated is a paperwork word. It describes an absence on a map, not a biological impossibility. It is updated when someone submits the evidence to update it, and left standing, unquestioned, for as long as nobody does. It says nothing about whether the habitat has changed in the intervening century, whether the animal's range has quietly crept back toward the boundary it once held, or whether anyone with a reason to look has been looking hard enough in the right places to notice if it has. A species map is not a live sensor. It is a snapshot from the last time somebody bothered to check, and in a borough with 3 million residents and almost no systematic mesocarnivore monitoring inside its own boundaries, the last time anyone checked for a fisher was, functionally, never. The question is not whether a forest predator can survive at the edge of the largest city in North America. Isolated fisher sightings have been confirmed in far more developed landscapes than the Bronx. The question is not whether the historical range once included this ground. The trapping ledgers already answer that. The question is whether a species written off the city's map more than 100 years ago has been working its way back onto it, unnoticed, one green corridor at a time, while the label extirpated sits unchanged in the reference books because nobody has had a reason to update it. New York City looks, from above, like a closed system, a grid of concrete with parks scattered through it like isolated islands. On the ground, for an animal that doesn't cross open pavement if it can help it, the city looks more like a network with gaps. The Bronx River Greenway runs nearly the full length of the borough, a ribbon of wooded riverbank connecting Westchester County down through Bronx Park and the Botanical Gardens' forested edges before opening into Starlight Park and the estuary at the river's mouth, built, by design, as a wildlife corridor. Running parallel to it, the old Metro North Rail easements carry their own strips of untended brush the length of the borough, unmonitored by anyone except transit maintenance crews. Pelham Bay Park, nearly 3 times the size of Central Park, anchors the northeast corner. Salt marsh, oak forest, and rocky outcrop large enough to support a resident deer herd and, increasingly, coyotes that arrived by the same overland logic now under examination for the fisher. Further west, the Sawmill River Corridor and the old Croton Aqueduct Trail thread a nearly unbroken line of wooded parkland from Westchester down through Yonkers, stopping just short of the Bronx's edge at Van Cortlandt Park, over 1,100 acres of forest, wetland, and ridge, close enough to the Yonkers corridor that an animal moving through cover could cross from one to the other without leaving a tree line for more than a few dozen yards at a stretch. String these corridors together on a map, and what emerges isn't a closed city grid at all. It's a broken chain of green, far more continuous than anyone planning a subway route would ever have reason to notice. None of these corridors were built with a fisher in mind. That's precisely what makes them relevant. A fisher does not need a wildlife crossing sign or a conservation easement. It needs continuous cover, a few hundred yards of trees or brush between one patch and the next, and the willingness to move at night when the humans who might notice it are indoors. The distance from the Fishers' confirmed range in central Westchester County to the Bronx border along the river corridor is roughly 18 miles as the crow flies. Well within the range, dispersing Fishers are documented to cover in a matter of weeks, not seasons. Coyotes made the same crossing a decade earlier, using largely the same corridors, and went from a single confirmed Bronx sighting in 1994 to an established, breeding, multi-park population within 20 years. Proof, on this exact ground, that the city's patchwork of overlooked green space can function as a real migration route for a mid-sized mammal willing to use it. Fisher populations in New York had all but vanished by the 1930s, hunted and trapped to the edge of the state's northern wilderness. A managed reintroduction effort in the Adirondacks, paired with decades of forest regrowth as farmland reverted to woodland, allowed the population to rebuild through the mid-20th century. What happened next is the part official range maps have struggled to keep pace with. Beginning in the 1990s, Fisher sightings and confirmed roadkill records began appearing steadily south of the Adirondack Catskill stronghold, moving down through Ulster and Dutchess counties, and, by the early 2000s, into central and southern Westchester, territory the species hadn't occupied in living memory. A fur-bearer monitoring initiative tracked the trend across 2 decades of trapper harvest reports, roadkill logs, and camera trap data, and the pattern wasn't a fluke sighting here and there. It was a slow, steady, southward tide. Dispersal biology explains why that tide moves the way it does. Juvenile male fishers, once they reach sexual maturity at roughly 1 year old, are pushed out of their mother's territory and forced to find unclaimed ground of their own, a common pattern across solitary mustelids, but an unusually aggressive one in this species. Females hold tight, defended territories of a few square miles, and rarely leave them. Males, competing for access to multiple female ranges, roam far wider and are consistently responsible for the long dispersal movements that show up at the edge of a species' known range. Radio collar studies on dispersing male fishers in the northeastern United States have recorded individuals covering 20 to 30 miles in under a month, crossing roads, rail lines, and residential development with a tolerance for fragmented habitat that surprised the researchers who collared them, expecting a far more forest-dependent animal. One especially wide-ranging collared male, tracked in a multi-year Catskill region study, covered more than 60 linear miles in a single winter before settling, a distance that, applied to the Bronx River corridor, puts the entire lower Hudson Valley comfortably within a single dispersing animal's reach in one season, let alone the 2 decades the species has already had to work with. A fisher does not need wilderness. It needs a chain of cover it can move through mostly at night, and the lower Hudson Valley, for all its highways and subdivisions, still offers exactly that, right up to the city line. Population density estimates from the Fur-Bearer Monitoring Program suggest territorial saturation in the core range is itself becoming a pressure-driving dispersal outward. Young males finding every reasonable territory already claimed, forced by the same competitive logic that pushed the species north a century ago to test the margins of the range instead. What contracted the Fishers' territory in the 1800s was human pressure-removing habitat. What may be expanding it now is the opposite, a recovered population outgrowing the space it has, with nowhere left to go but the one edge of its range nobody has been watching. If you've made it this far, you already understand why this case is different from the usual raccoon in the attic story city wildlife officials field every week. This channel exists for exactly this kind of gap, the space between what the record says and what the ground is quietly showing. If that's the kind of investigation you want more of, subscribe. This is where the cases science hasn't closed get followed all the way to the evidence. The clearest single data point in this investigation comes from a stretch of the Bronx River corridor, just north of the city line, in the town of Yonkers, where a wildlife camera set as part of a mesocarnivore monitoring survey captured a fisher crossing a footbridge over the river at 2:14 in the morning in November of 2021. The animal was large enough, and moved with a gait distinctive enough that researchers reviewing the footage flagged it immediately rather than filing it as an unidentified mustelid, the default classification for blurry night captures of animals in that size class. What made the sighting significant wasn't the single frame, it was the follow-up. The same camera station, along with two others placed along the corridor at roughly half-mile intervals, recorded what researchers believe was the same individual, identified by a distinctive notch in the left ear, consistent across 3 separate captures. On 4 more occasions over the following 14 months, each sighting progressively closer to the city boundary. The animal, informally logged in survey notes as M19, was never fitted with a radio collar and was never physically captured. Everything known about its movement comes from a trail of camera-trap timestamps and GPS-tagged station locations, triangulated after the fact into a rough travel path. It was not lost. That is the plain reading of the data, even though no formal study has been published claiming to prove it. An animal does not wander 4 documented waypoints in a straight southward line over more than a year by accident. Dispersing fishers do explore dead ends and double back. Collared individuals in other studies have looped, backtracked, and abandoned territory before settling, sometimes covering the same few square miles for months before moving on again. M19's pattern didn't loop. It moved, camera station by camera station, toward the one large green corridor that would carry it directly into the Bronx. Each successive capture logged closer to the city line than the one before it, with no capture at any point showing the animal moving back north. The last confirmed capture of M19 in January of 2023, he placed the animal at a camera station roughly 1.5 miles north of the city boundary. Close enough that the same green corridor carrying it southward runs, without a meaningful gap, directly into the northern reaches of the Bronx River Greenway on the city side of the line. No camera exists on the New York City side of that boundary to confirm what happened next. That absence is not evidence the animal turned back. It is simply the edge of where anyone was watching, and everything documented about M19's behavior up to that point argues against an animal that changes direction once it finds cover it can use. But there is a case in the record far harder to dismiss than a notched ear on a night vision camera, and it predates M19 by more than 3 decades. In the fall of 1987, a New York City Parks Department forester was conducting a routine survey of storm-damaged trees in Van Cortlandt Park's northern woodland when he encountered the animal along a drainage embankment. What the hook only summarized, the paperwork spells out in full: the notch on the left ear, the low, dark-furred build, the head-first drop down the embankment into a culvert rather than the scrambling descent a raccoon or opossum would make. He had no particular reason to know what he was looking at. He simply wrote down what he saw and, within the week, filed it as an official wildlife observation report. Standard procedure for any city employee encountering an unusual species while on duty. That report should have entered New York State's Natural Heritage Tracking System, the database used to log rare species observations statewide. It didn't. Departmental records show it sitting, unprocessed, for 11 months, before being forwarded not to the state database, but to a small, unpublished research file with no public index and no listed purpose. No follow-up survey was ever commissioned. Current department staff, asked decades later, have no explanation for why the observation was routed that way, only confirmation that it was. Bureaucratic misfiling is, on its own, an unremarkable explanation, and probably the correct one. Records get lost inside large institutions for reasons that have nothing to do with concealment, understaffing, unclear protocol, a system that changed formats twice since 1987. But the effect was to erase the earliest piece of hard evidence that a fisher had already reached the Bronx's interior parkland more than 3 decades before Ray Delgado found his coop torn open. Had that report entered the public record as designed, the extirpated since the early 1900s listing attached to this species in every reference document covering New York City would very likely have been revised, or at least flagged for review, years before a missing pigeon gave anyone reason to look again. What separates a Fisher kill from every other rooftop predator working the city is written into the animal's body. Its claws are semi-retractable, not fully sheathed the way a house cat's are, giving it a grip and drag capability suited to peeling back loosely secured wire rather than the tearing, puncturing damage a raccoon's blunt strength produces. A raccoon forces an opening and rips. A Fisher, built to work its claws under bark, prying apart rotting logs for grubs, is mechanically suited to something closer to unpeeling. More telling still is the Fisher's hind ankle joint, which rotates nearly 180 degrees, letting the animal descend a tree trunk head first, back feet splayed and gripping in reverse, something almost no other North American predator its size can do. Picture a socket wrench that turns in either direction without being removed and reset. That's the functional equivalent in a Fisher's hind leg, and it's the biggest reason this animal can reach rooftop structures that would stop a raccoon or a stray cat cold. Add a killing bite to the base of the skull rather than the torso, fast, targeted, comparatively bloodless, and a documented habit of caching surplus prey in the crotch of a tree or a similarly hidden, elevated spot to return to later. And the profile lines up point for point with the coop damage across 3 Bronx neighborhoods. The Pelham Bay keepers caught Pigeon, wedged 8 feet up with the head and neck removed, and the rest left intact, is close to a textbook description of Fisher food storage behavior, reproduced by a species no wildlife guide currently lists as active anywhere near it. Wildlife officials contacted about the pattern have offered a consistent, reasonable-sounding dismissal. A single confirmed camera capture north of the city line, they note, does not establish a breeding population inside it. Transient males disperse widely and pass through unsuitable habitat without settling. New York City has never been considered suitable Fisher habitat by any formal assessment. One notched ear on a Yonkers camera is not proof of a Bronx resident. It is not an unreasonable position. Wildlife agencies deal constantly with unconfirmed reports that turn out, on inspection, to be something far more mundane: an overweight house cat, an escaped ferret, a large rat in bad light. A single Fisher photographed a mile and a half outside city limits is thin evidence on its own, and no wildlife biologist would sign off on a range map revision from one camera trail alone. The counter-evidence complicates that position in 3 ways. Camera trap coverage inside city parkland is sparse compared to the dense monitoring grid used across the Westchester corridor, concentrated mostly around known coyote territory, rather than spread across every corridor a Fisher might use. So the absence of a confirmed in-Bronx capture may simply reflect where the cameras aren't, not where the animal isn't. Fisher sightings are also chronically misclassified by untrained observers, mistaken for large, feral cats, mink, or groundhogs in poor light, meaning unconfirmed reports likely undercount encounters rather than overstate them. And a Fisher caching its kills rather than leaving them exposed actively removes the physical evidence. Scattered feathers, carcasses, investigators typically rely on to confirm a predator's presence over time. A landscape with this much unmonitored green edge, this much misclassification risk, and a predator actively concealing its own kill sites is not built to produce easy confirmation. It is close to the ideal set of conditions for an animal to be present and undetected at once, which means the absence of a slam-dunk sighting inside city limits is, at best, not enough to confirm the population is established, and, just as importantly, not enough to dismiss that it already is. Ray Delgado never got an answer for his coop. 3 more incidents were reported along the Bronx River corridor that spring. A compost bin torn open near Bronx Park, chicken wire peeled back at an urban farm plot in Soundview, and a groundskeeper's blurry photo of a low, dark, weasel-shaped animal near the Botanical Gardens fence line before it vanished into the brush. None of it produced the unambiguous confirmation that would force a revision of the species' official range map. The extirpation listing for New York City stands exactly as it has for over a century, because no agency has yet logged the evidence needed to overturn it. Delgado rebuilt his coop with double-layered mesh and a motion light. He hasn't lost a bird since. Whether that means the animal moved on, found easier hunting elsewhere, or simply learned to work around the new defenses, nobody watching this case can say with confidence. His forum thread is still active, still collecting the occasional new report from a keeper elsewhere in the borough, describing the same peeled wire, the same missing birds, the same absence of the mess a hawk or raccoon would leave. What the record shows, when the geography, the dispersal data, the camera trail, and the kill pattern are laid side by side, is a predator. The city's own maps insist isn't there, moving through corridors nobody built for it, leaving a signature nobody in 3 generations of Bronx pigeon keeping has had to recognize. Until now. New York State's fur-bearer records still list the species as extirpated from the 5 boroughs, and will likely go on listing it that way until someone produces the one piece of evidence no committee can argue with. Until then, the designation on paper and the animal possibly already moving through the borough's overlooked green edges are simply 2 kinds of true existing at once, answering to different standards of proof. It is close to 4 in the morning again on a rooftop in the South Bronx. A different rooftop this time, a different keeper checking a different coop before first light out of habit more than concern. The wire is intact. The birds are quiet in the way pigeons are quiet when nothing has disturbed them. Nothing here tonight, nothing to photograph, nothing to post. Somewhere along the tree line, a few blocks north, in the strip of brush running behind the rail easement that nobody watches and nobody built for this, something with a socket wrench ankle and a century-old absence stamped on every map that claims to track it is already moving south again, unbothered by the distinction between documented and undetected, in no hurry at all to be found.